Stinks of spaghetti in here. So as you can see, I've got myself into a right old kerfuffle this week, but I guess the big news is the rack is complete. In fact, this lonely 2 HP attenuator didn't make the rack. May have to find him a new rack to put in. The final piece of the jigsaw, the final pieces of the jigsaw was the mixer, and it's these two modules here by Bafako, the Hex Mixer and the Hexpander. Whilst this Hex Mixer does an ample job of mixing signals, panning, it's got some basic kind of EQs in, these lovely mute buttons with a kind of, it has, if you push them all the way down, it has this audition function, which is great. I also wanted stemming capabilities, so I got the Hexpander, which gives some auxiliary sends, 3 auxiliary sends off across all channels, and then as you can see here, some direct outs, which will give us our stemming options, because I am actually this week putting this bad boy to work. Now, I was hoping to prepare you a full kind of performance this week, and I do have a little bit I can play you later, but this patch isn't quite there yet. So I'd appreciate your feedback on things you feel I can do to improve it. In the meantime, this week I'm going to be jumping into the box to have a little look at a plugin by Madrone Labs, a really cool guy called Randy out on the West Coast who makes these really crazy multi-touch polyphonic expression controllers called the Sound Plane. He also makes a suite of plugins. Originally I think the plugins were intended to demonstrate what the Sound Plane can do, but they're actually just incredibly good DSTs and audio units. So I thought I'd have a quick look at one of their plugins called Alto today, which is a sort of semi-modular system. It's very West Coast Buchla inspired, and it's just ridiculously powerful for what it is. So I thought we'd jump into the box and have a look at that. My build, I'm still having some delays with the completely DIY stuff, so I've decided to take a bit of a sojourn from that and work on some DIY kits and get a couple of smaller simple modules and start fleshing out the system a little bit. So the first of those kits has arrived in the post today. It's the Bafako Hex Mix VCA module, not their Hex Mix mixer. It's got 6 VCAs in there, and it can be paired with the mixer if I decide to add that in the future. Got a couple of other modules coming, so I'll do some build videos on those and talk about how you can put together a kit like that and what to expect in one. And then for each of the modules I'm going to try and do a bit of a deep dive, and we'll have a look at the features of what it can do and some of the things you might not expect to be able to do with it. But for now, let's jump into the box. Okay, so this is Alto by Madrone Labs, and it's a sort of a modular plugin. The bottom half of this is sort of semi-modular in that the signal path flows from left to right traditionally, although you can patch things around a bit. Essentially the bottom half here is your sound making and sound shaping part, and the top here is your sort of inputs and modulators and all sorts. So along the top we have a key module here, and this has the sort of pitches coming in from your keyboard. So you can see that pitch here is already patched into the pitch of this complex oscillator down here. I'll come back to that in a sec. We have a sequencer here, which has, you can click in these bars to set different values, and you can also click in here to set little gates. And these are output down here, and you can set the pitch range of this from 1 octave to 4 octaves to -4 octaves, or whatever you like really. If you double click any of these parameters, they'll jump back to their defaults. You also have an LFO, which has level, frequency, and also some noise in there to introduce some sort of non-linearity to the LFO. Pretty much all of these that are outputting a value, you can see this little patch point will actually flicker like a little LED. Just to show you what level the signal is at, so it's quite handy for, if I turn up the frequency there, you can see this blinks very, very quickly. We also have an envelope here. This is your typical ADSR. It's also, you can choose whether or not it has velocity sensitivity, also whether or not it's affected by your keys of your keyboard or by your sequencer. We also have a second envelope here, which can be controlled in various other ways. It can be very handy for adding sort of ping pong effects or adding strange filter envelopes and so on. So along the bottom here, and this is where the sort of real action happens. We have a complex oscillator, which is very sort of Buchla inspired. It's essentially, if I play this, since I have pitch and an envelope going into our gate here, I can play a note on my keyboard. And you'll hear what it sounds like. So we've got this sort of typical pitch here, where I can control the octave and so on of the carrier here. This is sort of an FM oscillator. But what we can also do is change our modulator
value and our modulation index, which can both affect the sound very dramatically. So if I hold down a note here, you can also introduce noise into the modulator and offset the pitch of it, which are both incredibly dramatic sounding. So you can hear how quickly that can kind of go off the rails and get very experimental sounding. For the carrier, we also have two controls here. We have a wave shape and the timbre. And the idea is that each of these is doing sort of more than one parameter in a way, and if you modulate more than one at a time, you're going to get some very, very complex and interesting sounds. That's then fed into a gate, and you can either have that as a typical volume gate, or if you enable low pass here, it will sound like what's called a Vactrol gate. I really like that low pass effect. I think it's very cool, and you can affect the responsiveness of that Vactrol. Vactrols are like a light sensor hooked up to a light, so they're a little bit sort of delayed in their onset. So if you set a really long delay on that, you get a nice little low pass filtering attack. After that, we have a sort of a delay line here. This can get into all sorts of crazy sort of feedbacking delays, or you can do just really nice sort of slapback stuff, and you have control over the input from the gate, as well as the feedback and the overdrive and so on, and you have wet and dry controls over here. But it can also go into audio rate, so I could set it to like 800 Hertz. And then you get some very interesting effects when you start playing with your feedback, and you get that kind of... You know, you can get real sort of squealing feedback. If you really mess around with this, you can make it sound like all sorts of things, like flute overtones and you know, like chiffs on a flute, or unusual sort of drum harmonics and ringing sounds and things like that. On the right of that, we have our filter, which is a multi-mode filter. So typically it's a low pass with resonance. But if you move this fader, it'll crossfade to high pass and then to band pass. And the band pass is great on this. And then finally, just before the output, we have a pan control, which is also automatable, and a reverb. So basically all of these little circles represent when something can be modulated by the sources above. Actually, these little circles are also what we call an attenuator. So it's like an attenuator. You can control the level of modulation that you're getting, and you can also invert it so it's going in the opposite direction. So attenuating and inverting, attenuator. The last thing we have here is a really nice sort of plate reverb sound, which is just really lush. You can patch all sorts of things in here. So if I throw, you just click and drag, and I could say get the LFO at quite a high level but slow frequency, and have that affecting a couple of different parameters here on the complex oscillator, but in different amounts, and by choosing their attenuator levels. So I could set the offset just a little bit, like a really, really small amount. And now when I play, so that's just by patching an LFO into 4 parameters on the oscillator. You can hear how immediately crazy it gets. Let's go a step further and patch our envelope into our cutoff of our filter. And we'll set that nice and low, set it to low pass, and set the attenuator nice and high. And maybe we want to get a nice delay effect on there as well. So you can hear how immediately sort of crazy that can get, but you can also use the internal sequencer instead of your keyboard. So this can modulate any of the parameters as well, and you can get into some really nice, crazy self-oscillating and self-sequencing setups. There's loads of really good presets with this. In fact, Richard Devine, there we go, he calls them mechanics, and I think a lot of them are sort of self-oscillating and self-generative things. So guard your ears, this might be a bit louder. you know, that's just a little glimpse into how incredibly powerful and crazy that can get. And it's a really good way to dip your toes into the sort of semi-modular thing and just get an idea for what it's like to get about patching between different modules. And I think it's on sale at the moment for the summer, so have a look. It's on Madrone Labs is the company that makes it, and it's like, even at full price, it's like $99. It's really good.
Thanks as always, Sandy, and I will be checking out that piece of software. Looks really interesting. Right, back to this patch. Okay, basically over the last few weeks you've been seeing me kind of starting to dabble with performances and putting things together with my kind of vintage synths alongside this, and getting this to interact with my vintage synths and this to do stuff of its own accord. So what I've done this week, this is a 4-piece band on this patch. So we've got the disting playing some samples that are being triggered once every cycle by this sequencer. And thanks to the person who advised me on being able to actually dial back the divisions of the clock out. It's really handy. That is also triggering the woggle bug, which is at random selecting different samples. Now what I did is I curated some aleatoric string samples that I'd written and recorded, and I turned them into 33, which is the maximum disc handle, 33 different samples. So everything's being triggered every cycle, including a random event that selects a random sample. Now the second band member is the Atlantis playing an arpeggio, which again is being sequenced by the Metropolis. Finally, where the modular rack is concerned, we've got the S2O oscillator, which is playing a bass note, which is being determined by this Moog Prodigy over here. So basically that is being sent into the audio in and then into this second disting, which is doing some pitch tracking, which determines what the oscillator here is doing. I've also employed the use of a patch cable, not for what it's intended, but to hold this F down. Again, this represents why I'm not particularly happy with this patch at the moment, really having to DIY it. And at the end of the piece, I have to employ my macro, it's quite a heavy lens, and place that on the B flat so I can get back to the rig to kind of fade it out. So, far from ideal. Giving you a kind of brief overview because a lot of people have been feeding back on the previous Modular Mondays, and it has got to a point where it's quite easy to get lost. I'm thinking about better ways of explaining what it is I've done, but I think maybe just concentrating on what the 4 different voices are doing is possibly the best way for now. So the 4th voice is my Wurlitzer going into that Axe Effects thing that you heard last week. But what I've also done is I've multiplied it on my external patch bay, so the rack is getting just the raw version of the Wurlitzer, which is going into my multi-band spectral resonator. And what that is doing is kind of triggering how aggressive this arpeggiator is. So what you'll hear when I really hit the B flat, this thing really comes to life. All right. As I say, I'll get more in depth next week when I'm happier with the patch, but I just want to give you a kind of an idea of where I'm headed with this. Okay. So when I get this patch right, I'll get more in depth with it with you. It sounds a little brittle to me at the moment, and possibly just a little bit kind of tool sheddy, lacks the finesse I'm looking for, and possibly drums, which is fortunate because I think we should add this in next week. So join me for that. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit subscribe. If you like what I do, hit like. And if you want to be notified the next time I put a video up, hit that little bell button. See you next time.